Hello everybody, it's time for another Q&A, and I am obviously riddled with guilt that I haven't had one for a while, but I have been somewhat busy trying to knock out some of the last episodes and putting them all together so you all have something to watch while I'm traveling around filming more. And I'm trying to answer as many questions as I can in the general chat and answer emails, but it's all piling up and I am just me. So let's get to some Q&A questions. We're going to talk about Himmler's castle and how he was trying to blow it up and why. We're going to talk about ships sunk at Normandy and talk about munitions, penetrating the Maginot line, and a few other things. Let's start. First things first. Henning, he asks, why would Himmler have instructed an SS division that he sent to the castle to secure the secrets in his safe as opposed to just blowing it all up? Because the story goes, Himmler sent Maginot, his second-in-command, to blow up his castle with 15 SS men. They arrived on 15 March and did not have quite enough explosives to blow up the castle. So on that day they also contacted the local fire department and told them that they were going to set it on fire and they shouldn't put it out. So they blew up what they could, set the rest on fire. Wewelsburg being made of stone, of course it was gutted, because Himmler didn't want the Allies, or Russians, or anybody, to get a hold of all the stuff he had in Wewelsburg, which I suppose makes sense, because we're not entirely sure what he actually had there. What we do know is there was a safe in the basement, and the story goes that some days after the castle had been burned, it was looted by the locals, and after that, an American unit showed up and blew up the safe and took whatever was inside. Have never been seen or heard from since. So the question was from Henning, why did the detachment he sent with his second-in-command, a very, very highly decorated SS Sturmbannführer, didn't he tell him just to empty the safe? And see, there's a couple of things that's missing to the whole timeline and the story of that. Because how did we know he didn't? We know that Maginot, he went there. We know that Maginot, he had the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, and he was assigned to Himmler in 1944 as his number 2. And we have Werner Grothmann, and of course you have Dr. Brandt, and Himmler had trusted people around him, even at that time. So on 31st March, he sent Maginot to blow up the castle with 15 guys. The story goes that Maginot was also to, there's SS rings. One of the things that Himmler wanted Wewelsburg to be as the SS castle and as a school, and research and study of his interest in the occult and so on and so forth, was Maginot was supposed to take the 9,000 SS rings. Every time an SS man had been killed in battle, his ring would be sent to Wewelsburg and put there on display, and the higher ranking had their displays, and ashes were supposed to be there. And there's a whole lot of rumors and things going on about exactly what the plan was at Wewelsburg. But I do know Himmler, he held high-level meetings there, amongst others, with our favorite General Kammler. So there were obviously papers there, and if there was a safe, as if the whole castle was not safe enough, it would have been for something very special that Himmler wanted preserved. So why did Maginot not empty the safe? I say he did, because what the story is, Maginot went to blow up the castle, but after that he met back up with Himmler, because Himmler and Grothmann and Maginot later after that went up to Flensburg to try to do a deal for be part of the new government with Dönitz, who told them to bugger off, which they did, and they were not captured, the three, together until May 27. So Maginot went, he blew up Wewelsburg, and then he met back up with Himmler. Of course he emptied the safe. Of course he emptied the safe and took whatever was the most important and brought that back to Himmler, because they spent almost 2 months together after that, which I think is an important part. We don't really know who the American unit were, but if they were there and they found a safe, they would probably try to blow it up, and if there was nothing in it, because who's to say that Maginot didn't empty the safe and then closed it? I probably would have. So of course that also gives us the reason why that's why there's no indications of what was taken from the safe by this American unit, because there's nothing in it. The 9,000 death set rings have also not been found, although there's a few on display in the museum at Babelsberg. It is very much a museum, and there's very little left or indication left of whatever Himmler and the SS did there. It's more a natural area museum. With one of the buildings, there's some papers and books and pictures and artifacts from the time of the war and Himmler's construction of the castle, reconstruction of the castle. So there's not a whole lot left there that pertains to what Himmler was actually doing there. But there's some pages of diary and some notes and some rings and a few things there. My interest would be on Macher's way back to see Himmler. What route did he take? And then where from Flensburg, did they meet in Flensburg, or did they go to Flensburg together? As I have an impression. Was there any SS locations on that route, or on their way from Flensburg to wherever they were eventually captured, that would have been a place to stash or hide these things? But it is an indication that this was not exactly, this was a time of, to say the last month of World War II was a time of turmoil. That might be an understatement. But the fact that we have a 15-man strong SS detachment directly under orders of Heinrich Himmler, who can't get enough explosives to blow up his own castle, should be an indication that this was probably closer to a last minute than a plan. That also leaves, well, where did they then eventually stash all the things? There's a lot of things that disappeared from World War II. There's a lot of stuff that we know are missing, and there's a lot of stuff that we don't know existed that are then also missing. And like Himmler's diary was presumably taken by some American soldiers who raided his house, and that, to my knowledge, still have not been found, although some people have indicated they had it or seen it. And that's just another message to when great-grandparents start passing away, the things that they have hidden in the attic, or they find, or their grandchildren find, nothing's more important than to catalog this and send that to museums, or send it to, you know, me, especially in Germany. Hör sie mir, in Deutschland. So, yeah, that is, my contention is that he emptied the safe, he took whatever was important, he met back up with Himmler. And then they eventually were captured without it. So there is my theory. So now the route they took is what becomes interesting, and we'll get back to that. There's a gentleman who has written me several times, and I've written him back and tried to call him because he has a whole lot of maps that he inherited from his mother, because his father or grandfather was in the SS and had maps of SS locations throughout Germany. I am still trying to communicate, and I'm still hoping that I get to see some of those. Maybe some of those are on the way. So, there. Rob asks me about the ships off Normandy, of the D-Day landing beaches, and he asks, he was just wondering, did the Germans actually ever sink any Allied battleships in and out of the harbors, either there or during the invasion of Normandy? It seems that historians never talk about battleship losses during the D-Day invasion. Drake, historians never talk about the naval losses of D-Day. That is your department. However, I will crawl my way into the wet and see what actually was sunk. Because it's not a secret that the Germans pretty much lined up most of the coast with rather heavy guns. And one would think that they hit a few things, and they did. Actually, so few ships were sunk that I can go into a little bit more detail than just list them all. This question will also dovetail into one about the Fritz X and guided munitions around D-Day. Don't think it was the same that asked, but we're going to cover both, so there you are. The USS Corey, which is a Cleves-class destroyer, also known as the Bristol class, launched in 1941 and it was involved in the Allied invasion of Sicily. However, when it came time to the D-Day landings, she would leave Norfolk on April 20th, 1944, I'm sure to celebrate Hitler's birthday, and she would participate in the staging of the Normandy invasion. And she would arrive off the coast of Normandy, and she would head to Île-Sainte-Marcouf, which was her station to lend fire support right off the Utah beachheads. And unfortunately, as she closed in on the time of the Allied landings, she was about 1,000 yards offshore from the coastal batteries, and there was a plane supposed to put down a smoke screen for her, and it was shot down. Aerial losses, which was almost miraculous considering the staggering numbers of Allied planes. Anyway, that left her exposed and started getting into it with an 8-inch shore battery. She would lay off some 1,000 rounds of 5-inch shells to support of the landings, but the shore batteries, which is 210mm, about 8-inch rounds, would eventually hit her midships and give her rudder damage, and she would sail around in circles and she would eventually sink. However, got to get a little bit of American heroicism on that one. One of her sailors, as she was sinking, sailed up her mainmast and hoisted the flag, and as she settled on the bottom, that flag still remained above the water line. She had 24 killed and 60 wounded of her crew. But interesting story, and that's probably one of the biggest ships that were sunk during the D-Day invasion. So battleship. Then you also had the HMS Svena, which was a S-class destroyer built by the British and lent to the Free Norwegian forces, and was sent off to fight at Normandy. The ship was armed with 4 45 caliber 4.1-inch guns and dual-purpose mounts, and for anti-aircraft she had 1 twin Bofors 40mm gun and 4 twin 20mm autocannons. She was fitted with 2 above-water quadruple mounts for 21-inch torpedoes and 2 depth charge rails and 4 throwers that was fitted with a 70 depth charges. She was laid down in 1940. She was commissioned in 1944 in March, and she was sunk on June 6th, 1944. So, well, she had a good couple of months, I guess. Anyway, she had the distinction of having 2 different claims of how she was sunk. She was running off Le Havre, and she was supposedly hit midships with torpedoes fired from either the Jaguar or the Möven, from the 5th Torpedo Boat Flotilla. And it was also stated that she was sunk by a guided bomb. I'll get into that when we get to the guided bomb part of this section. However, for the sake of argument, she was sunk by the torpedo boats. 32 Norwegian and 1 British crewmen were killed. 185 were rescued from the crew. And the memorial wreck can be found approximately 100 yards on the seaside of the coast road of Hermansville-sur-Mer. Then you had the J400 Magic. She was a Catherine-class minesweeper, and she was lost in 1943. She was part of a set of 20 that was lend-leased to Britain from America, and eventually some of them came back. Well, 17 of them came back. However, the Magic was not one of them. They were quite well armed. She was an AUK class. The Magic class had about a maximum speed of 18 knots. She was a minesweeper. And she was 1 single 3-inch gun, 2 40mm Bofors guns, 8 20mm Oerlikons, displaced about 890 tons. Unfortunately, she was struck by a mine, one of those things she was made to counter or sweep, right off Le Havre. And the interesting thing about her is she looked similar to the preceding Raven class, but adopted a diesel-electric rather than diesel propulsion to permit magnetic mining sweep gear to be powered. And then you had one of the more interesting events, an LST. And I spent a little time on an LST. They're kind of cool. Big-ass landing craft. That's not what it stands for. Anyway, the LST-280 was listed as sunk by a submarine U-621 off Barfleur. And then she was lost. And then she wasn't. And then she, by the way, probably wasn't sunk by that submarine at all. But if you look at some of the dispatches, the LST-280 was lost on June 6th. However, it's rather interesting that despite being lost, she returned to the United States on 11 April 1946, where she was decommissioned in 1946. So I guess she wasn't that lost. Either you're sunk or you're not. However, what probably happened, besides the fact that in the fog of war sometimes things are written off, but still today, if you look up losses on D-Day, you'll find the LST-280. But she was damaged by, initially thought, by a German torpedo from a submarine. However, it's much more likely that she was damaged by a torpedo bomber for a Ju-88 attack from either Kampfgeschwader 77 or Kampfgeschwader 26. She was towed back to the UK and repaired by the Royal Navy. And like I said, in 1946 she returned to the United States. So she was only a little bit sunk. And then there were a few more smaller vessels that were sunk on June 6th. For instance, there were 16 LCI, landing craft infantries, that were sunk. Remember that number, because 16 of the small landing craft that we keep seeing in movies fluttering around and being sunk and blown up by German artillery, 16 is probably not as many as we thought. However, I'll get back to that in a second. Then you had 41 LCTs, landing craft tanks, sunk. There's then 2 LCF landing craft flak that was sunk, 3 LCG landing craft gun that was sunk, and 1 LCH landing craft heavy that was sunk. Now, if you take a look at all the small landing crafts, they're small and relatively flimsy, and it would not take that much to sink them or to blow them up. That there's only 16 of those infantry craft sunk during the entirety of D-Day is not entirely correct, because there was a lot of them and they were constantly coming and going. However, the majority of them were damaged or hit by coastal artillery or German guns or what have you, close to the beach. So close to the beach that they didn't actually sink. They just stranded, or they were destroyed or damaged on the beach, where they would just settle to eventually be recovered. So the majority of them were sunk so shallow waters that they didn't actually come under the category of having been sunk. They were just damaged and then repaired. Thus, the total write-off losses were only 16 of them, which is really not a lot. But the Normandy numbers are interesting, and there has been a lot of different numbers given in a lot of different places of the Normandy landings. And just for perspective, if you look at the damage actually done during Normandy, the Allies had 156,115 soldiers that landed in about 6,939 ships of different sizes and crafts. There were about 10,440 planes on D-Day, and the Germans were somewhat outnumbered in the sky, about 30-1. They only flew about 315 sorties on June 6th, whereas the Allies flew about 15,000 sorties. The casualties among the Allies on D-Day was about 4,413 lost. With the Germans, apparently the numbers vary between 4,000 and 9,000, but also the Allies' count is not always the same. But if you're looking at 4, 5, 6, 7,000 Germans lost and about 4,500 Allies lost on the beaches, and then from Allied shelling and bombing in support of the D-Day landings, you have about 20,000 French civilians killed. So when we say we're here to help you, I see why some of them were a little annoyed with the way we decided to do that. However, it was a target-rich environment, but there was a lot of ships that were sitting off the coast just shelling the German bunkers and forts and artilleries. Not as many ships were lost that could have been, considering the Germans had more than ample of targets floating around out there. It was a very well designed effort to keep their heads down so they wouldn't or couldn't. So basically, 3 larger ships were sunk on June 6th, and then a bunch of smaller ones. And in the days before and after, there was, of course, more that was sunk around Normandy. A lot of them struck mines, and as the coastal artilleries eventually was shut down, it was more mines and torpedoes and a few aircrafts that destroyed and took up the remaining count. I think there was some 25 ships of various sizes that were hit. And the warspite was there, which gets us into the German guided missile part of the conversation. Were there any Allied ships off the beach of Normandy on June 6th that was hit by any of the guided munitions, which was either the Fritz X or the Henchel? So one of the questions were any of the German guided munitions employed at Normandy? And for those of you who have obviously just seen my episodes from Peenemünde, where I visit with my friend out there who have the whole museum and parts of both of these, you will see how I describe the history and show parts of both the Fritz X guided bomb, the radio guided bomb, and the Henchel 293. I'll recap a little bit about them here. Basically, the Fritz X was a very heavy armored bomb, specifically for armor penetration and for bigger warships and battleships. And the Henchel was a bomb designed more for lighter skinned support vessels and merchant ships and so on and so forth, just because of the way they would detonate and because of the way they would penetrate. It was only the Kampfgeschwader 100 that flew and deployed these bombs. And in Normandy, we have just been told that initially it was thought that the Svena was hit by a Fritz X. Problem with that is, if it had been hit by a guided munitions, it would probably have had to be a Henchel, because and it was only the third group of the 100 Kampfgeschwader that was equipped with guided bombs over Normandy or anywhere near Normandy, and they were all equipped with the Henchel. So if the Svena had been hit by a guided munition, it would have to have been a Henchel, and the problem was that the Svena was hit before they actually took off and made their attack run. So we can write that off on D-Day. So on D-Days there was nothing that was hit by German guided munitions. And also, if the Svena had been hit by Fritz X, which was again made to penetrate heavy armor, being a smaller 1700 ton, it would probably just have passed straight through her and detonated outside somewhere in the water. Still would have been bad, but I don't think it would have lodged itself in the ship. If you look at the damage the warspite took when down in the Mediterranean, she was attacked by 3 Fritz X that penetrated several of her decks and exploded down below, blew out all her boilers, and 1 near miss and another hit as well. They didn't sink the warspite, which was really good because Drac would have been heartbroken. Speaking of hero ships, I agree with you. A lot of the guided munitions were predominantly used in the Mediterranean, where they sunk quite a bit, and quite a bit before the Allies realized that these were guided munitions. They were also used in Normandy against bridges and land targets. Quick recap on the Fritz X, just so you know what we're talking about in case you did not see the Peenemünde episode. The Fritz X was a further development on the PC 1400 Sprengbombe, 1400 kilograms. It was an armor-piercing high-explosive bomb that was nicknamed Fritz X. It was a penetration weapon used against armored targets. Its minimum launch height was at 4,000 meters, that's about 13,000 feet, although 5,500 meters was to be preferred. at a range about 5 kilometers away from its target. It had an MCLOS guidance, and its operator had to keep the bomb in sight at all times. Thus, a tail flare was provided to assist the operator tracking the weapon, and the aircraft had to hold its course. And the aircraft controlling the bomb had to hold its course, so of course the operator could see where it was going. And because it was radio guarded, they also had to be able to be kept in contact with the radio. That made it rather hard to evade gunfire and impossible to evade fighters. 1,400 samples, including the trial models, were produced, and quite a few of them were put to use. It was only a third Gruppe of Kampfgeschwader 100 Viking that actually flew these bombs, including the Henchel. They employed the medium-range Dornier DO-217K2 for almost all of the attack missions. They did test them from the Henkel 111, but never flew those into actual missions with the plane. The first time the Fritz X was deployed was on 21 July 1943 on a raid on Augusta Harbor in Sicily. There was a number of additional attacks around Sicily and Messina that followed, although no confirmed hits were made, and it appears that the Allies were completely unaware that these large bombs were actually radio guided. It wasn't until September 9th that the greatest success with the Luftwaffe was actually achieved. After the Italian new Prime Minister, after kicking out Mussolini, had declared an armistice with the Allies. The Italian fleet had steamed out from La Spezia, was heading for Tunisia in order to surrender to the Allies. 6 Dorniers, 217Ks from the 3rd Gruppe, took off, each carrying a single Fritz X. The Italian battleship Roma, the flagship of the Italian fleet, received 2 hits and 1 near miss, and she sank after her magazines exploded. And she took down Admiral Carlos Bergani as well. And her sister ship, the Italia, was also seriously damaged, but she did reach Tunisia. On 11 September 1943, the American light cruiser USS Svena was hit by Fritz X during the invasion of Salerno, and she was forced to retire to the United States for 8 months worth of repairs. A single Fritz X has passed through the roof of the sea turret, killing, of course, the crew, and damaged the control party when it exploded in the lower ammunition handling room. The blast tore a large hole in the ship's bottom, opened a seam in her side, and blew out all fires in her boiler room. And the Svena was dead in the water, with the forecastle almost underwater. Svena's sister ship, that you probably heard the name, the USS Philadelphia, she was targeted earlier the same morning by Fritz X, and she just exactly missed her, exploding 15 meters away with minimal damage. You had the Royal Navy light cruiser, the HMS Uganda, was hit by a Fritz X off Salerno on 13 September, where the Fritz X passed through seven decks, straight through her keel, exploding underwater, just under the keel. There is 2 merchant ships that may have been hit by Fritz X around Salerno as well. However, the evidence is a little bit uncertain on that. The SS Bushrod Washington was hit by a guided bomb, either a Fritz X or a Henchel 293, we are not entirely sure, on 14 September while offloading cargo of gasoline. Bad time to be hit by anything. Now on 15 September, just like the Bushrod Washington, James W. Marshall was hit, but it's a little uncertain by what. A witness aboard one of the ships nearby, Joseph A. Yanichi, attributes the attack to a Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, which was way too small to carry a glide bomb. While the attacks with the Fritz X can't exactly be ruled out, there's at least an equal cause to suggest that if a glide bomb was involved, the culprit might as well have been a 293 from the 2nd Kampfgeschwader 100, which also flew these. The Luftwaffe records show that the 2nd Gruppe Kampfgeschwader 100 was only armed with the HS 293 glide bombs, and they were active over Salerno that day. It does not show any records of if the Stukas was also flying over that time, but given that it was not exactly the safest platform to fly, they probably were not, and I'm leaning towards the Henchel. The KG-100 also achieved another success with the Fritz X when they hit the war spite, as we talked about. She was providing gunfire support over Salerno. Now, one Fritz X penetrated 6 decks before exploding in boiler room number 4. That would, like I said, blow out all the fires and her double bottom. Second Fritz X nearly missed her, holding her just at the waterline. She took out about 5,000 tons of water, lost steam, and she eventually had to go back for repairs, serious repairs, and one of the boilers never returned back to full use, although she ended up off the coast of Normandy lending fire support until she was out of ammunition, and pretty much at that point her guns were so worn out that she sailed back home for a longer refit. The last Fritz X that was deployed over Salerno damaged the USS light cruiser Philadelphia by 2 near misses. Besides the Philadelphia, there was 2 other ships that were damaged on the 17th of September, the Dutch sloop Flores and the British destroyer Loyal, but none of the 3 were entirely sunk. The Fritz X had also been credited with having damaged 3 other ships. The HMS Newfoundland at Salerno, and the destroyer HMS Janus, and the HMS Spartan at Anzio. However, it is more likely, due to the damage that was inflicted on these ships and the way they were damaged, that this was done by a Henchel, although in the case of the Janus, it might have been a conventional torpedo. Only forensics from the battle damage can sort of give us a guess, but again we're looking at the Fritz X would have penetrated some of these lighter armed ships and not actually detonated inside the ship. The Henchel was a glide bomb, radio controlled, and had a rocket attached to it. It was a little bit more successful than the Fritz X, given the fact that it actually sank a bit more tonnage. It was designed for lighter skinned ships. On the 25th of August 1943, used in the first successful attack of a guided missile, successful in the sense that it struck the sloop HMS Biddeford. However, the warhead did not detonate. So it hit it, but it didn't sink it. So, well, I guess the radio control was successful, more so than the bomb itself. So, of course, the damage was a bit minimal. However, on the 27th of August, it sank the British sloop HMS Uganda, and on November 22nd, an HS-293 sank the troop transport HMT Rodna, killing over 1,000 people. It is war, but I suppose that's, from the Germans' point of view, more successful than just hitting the ship and not sinking it. There's quite a few other ships that was also sunk by the 293. For instance, the HMS Athabascan, which was heavily damaged, the Italian destroyer Ugolino Vivaldi was heavily damaged and scuttled off Sardinia. The SS Bushrod Washington was sunk. The SS Delirious was damaged. The HMS Dulverton was damaged and scuttled. The SS Elihu Yale sank off Anzio. The USS Herbert C. Jones was damaged off Anzio. The SS Hiram S. Maxim was damaged. The HMS Ingelfeld was sunk. The SS James W. Marshall was damaged. The HMS Janus was sunk. The HMS Jervis was damaged off Anzio. The SS John Birvad was damaged. And a Bailiff-class sloop HMS Langard was slightly damaged with the Biddeford in Bay of Biscayne on 25 August. The HMS LST-79 was sunk. This is what the Henchel was actually for, smaller, lighter-skinned crafts. And if it could stop the troops coming to the shore, well, it was doing its part for the war effort, I suppose. The USS LST-282 was sunk during Operation Dragoon. The HMS Lawford was sunk. The MV Marsa was sunk. The HMCS Martain was sunk. The USS Mayo was damaged, probably by an H-293, or it could have been by a mine. Again, sometimes I guess it's a little hard to tell. The HMS HS Newfoundland was heavily damaged and later scuttled. The USS Prevail was damaged. The HMS Rockwood was damaged. The SS Samite was damaged. The SS Samuel Huntington was sunk off Anzio, and the SS Selvig was damaged. The HMS Spartan was sunk off Anzio. The USS Tillman was slightly damaged in November while escorting the Mediterranean convoys. So, one can say that the guided munitions were starting to take a toll on Allied shipping around the later 1943 mark. Of course, radio jamming was a real thing in Normandy. And some of these were also used for some of the bridges, not overly successfully, I will say. However, the original two questions were what ships were sunk during D-Day. Well, there were 3 primary ships that were sunk by Germans, and there were none that were hit by guided munitions. And the Svena, I think we can write off simply because of the logistics, it weren't. And now, back to the Maginot Line. So, the question is, and I'm not even going to tell them your name, you evil, evil man. You made me have to read countless of pages and books of statistics and penetration numbers and the most dull and boring research into bomb penetration testing. Do you have any idea how dull these are? But that's what we're here for. The question was, is there any other modern day bunker busting munitions or penetrating munitions that could damage the Maginot Line forts, and especially, of course, the underground tunnels and hallways? So let's talk about the two I visited, and you've seen episodes recently. Hackenberg tunnels. Well, Hackenberg was built into rock, so on average they are about 30 meters underground. Some a little bit more, some a little bit less, but they are quite deep into a mountain. Fort Cassel, the tunnels about the same, variably 30 to 20 meters as well. You had the steel domes, depending on which observation, firing between 20 and 33 centimeters of steel, some in layers. And the actual casemate walls, somewhere between 1.5 to 2.5 meters. That's the target. That's what we're looking at, and that's kind of where it is. So now we have to look at what bombs and weaponry do we have today that can penetrate to that depth, and how would they actually do? Ever since World War II, the requirements for bombs to destroy hardened, buried targets became more and more of a thing because of the use of thick and reinforced concrete structures providing some shelter for something like such the submarines and other military installations. The perforation capability of the American 1,600-pound AN Mk1 armor-piercing bomb was 2.7 meters if dropped from about 30,000 feet. There was also the British bomb, 12,000-pound bomb, the Tall Boy, and the 22,000 Grand Slam bombs. The armor-piercing bombs manufactured in different countries would have likely about similar performances. So now we're looking at in 1945 munitions that could penetrate at least 2.7 meters of concrete. That was back then, or reinforced. So that was back then. So that would pretty much be it for the casemates up around the ground for the Maginot Line forts. Of course, you can also penetrate the hallways that ran between them if you could find them. Chances are that even if they're 30 meters deep, that they are in a line between the two forts. So give and take, you'll probably hit it. But you have it hitting an empty hallway, and the fortresses could fight independently. But of course, if you could already then penetrate 2.7 meters of reinforced concrete, you already have sort of a bit of an issue. During World War II, the Germans were working on bunker-busting artillery shells developed by German engineer August Kudness. It's based on the theory that increasing sensational density to improve penetration. They were tested in 1942 and 43 against the Belgian forts successfully. After the war, the US added a remote control guidance to the Tall Boy and created the Tarzan. Again, we're back to who comes up with these names. So now you have a 12,000 pound bomb that was guided, and this was amongst others used during the Korean War against some of the command centers of the North Korean army. So we're working our way up to penetrating deeper and deeper as we go. During the Desert Storm, there is a need for a deep penetration bomb again, something that sort of had been neglected since, and none of the NATO air forces at the outset of the 91 Gulf War really had deep penetration munitions at that point. So they started working on something, and actually within 28 days they came up with something using an 8-inch 203mm artillery barrel as a casing, and the bomb weighed about 2 tons and would carry 293 kilos of high explosives. It was laser guided, and it was designated Guided Bomb Unit 28, GPU 28, and it was totally efficient, as we have seen in numerous videos from the Gulf War. Now, the Russian bunker buster had a KAB 1500L-PR that was delivered with the Su-24M and the Su-27 1B aircrafts. And they were stated that they could penetrate 10 to 20 meters of earth or 2 meters of reinforced concrete. The bombs weighed about 1,500 kilos. Now, still, we're not down at the 30 meters of the Maginot Line yet. So, what else did we get? The super penetrator that can penetrate reinforced concrete of 6 meters. One of the things that is really interesting that we're working on now is ATK, Alliance Tech Systems, are working on a hard target void censoring fuse. Because one thing is, if you have a bomb that slams into the ground and buries in and then explodes, it may not explode at the right tunnel or where you want it. This thing will actually count how many floors or how deep it goes before it sets off the warhead. And just like what Deepno was preaching back in the day, there's also research working into shape-charged warheads that would penetrate even deeper and have a secondary stage charge that would first blow a hole, and the second one will enter the hole and then explode inside a tunnel. So it's getting more and more hairy for the Maginot Line, given the munitions we're working on today. Then you had the GBU 57AB Massive Ordnance Penetrator, MOP, which is a precision-guided 30,000 pound bunker buster bomb that we are using in the U.S. Air Force. The deepest penetrating bunker busters that we have available. The Massive Ordnance Penetrator, what a cool name, Massive Ordnance. I think I want to get that as a tattoo. Anyway, of course 30,000 pounds is really heavy, and not everything can carry it. So of course we're working on the next generation penetrator munitions that we're down to 5 and 2,000 pounds, so it can be carried by smaller aircraft. And that is what have been asked for now by Global Strike Command. The thing the MOP doesn't have is a censoring, void censoring fuse, so it will just go as deep as it can, then it'll explode. What they want with the next generation is a lighter weapon with the same capability that have a void censoring fuse and will know when it hits the void and there explode. But the MOP will have a penetration of the 30 meters we need for the Maginot Line, and possibly a little bit more. Now, we're looking at, say, Fort Hackenberg, which is built into a mountain. Now, mountain rock is a lot harder than just going through the 30 meters of earth that Fort Cassell's hallways would be under. So, question is, could it go through the mountain and into the hallways? Well, if we have any doubt, there's also the next step up, or down, as this happens to be. We are looking at having made a earth-penetrating 1.2 megaton B-83 warhead, which is the highest yield weapon in the U.S. nuclear stockpile. it will crush underground bunkers at about 1,000 feet down. Of course, it's a nuclear weapon, so it will also render the area rather uninhabitable for a while. So if you really think you can sit at Fort Harkenberg and be the evil villain and sit there with your little stroke your kitty cat and wait for Mrs. Bond to come get you, well, then a 1.2 megaton nuclear warhead will get you at 1,000 feet underground. And of course then you have earthquake munitions that will not have to specifically hit where you are, but it will make the earth tremble to the point where everything will fall down around you anyway. You have EMPs that will penetrate through the openings of the Maginot Line doors, so you could eventually run out of electricity. That thing will happen. And then you have the whole other issue. You have the munition entrance, which is straight. Even if there's 1, 2, 3 armored and heavy steel doors, with the technology we have today, we can still shove a missile straight through those doors and explode right near where your magazine M1 is. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily hide out there. Now you're also looking at a significant expense, so these weapons are not cheap, which of course is helpful. I think they paid $28 million for the first 20 ground penetration bombs, which is significant. So I mean, you have to do something bad enough to deserve having dropped one of those things on your head if you're hiding in your Maginot Line fort. Now, of course, you could think that, alright, you're not going to sit in the hallways, you're going to sit in your steel dome, because that's fairly impervious to at least quite a bit of shelling. RPGs probably will not go through your 30 centimeters of steel in your dome. However, the tow missile will. The new and heaviest tow missile system, the BMG-7-1D, will penetrate 900 millimeters of steel. Although the CIA have recently released a secret report. Yeah, I don't know why the CIA would release anything that they deem once secret. I did not think that was in the agency's nature. However, they have let out that under combat conditions, even the heaviest of tow missile weapon systems will not penetrate more than about 430 millimeters of steel, which will still not leave you safe in your Maginot Light Fort dome. So there. And a note on the tow missile system, which is wire guided, and I'm trained on it, and I really don't like it. It's also stuck on helicopters. Don't like it there either. Problem of, yes, it might be a standoff weapon, but it is not a fire and forget weapon. You literally have to fire the thing, and then you just have to sit there for the 10, 15, 20 seconds and paint the target while the missile is spinning around to get there. Which means you start by setting off a big-ass plume of smoke and a boom wherever you are, and letting the enemy know that you're there and you fired something, giving them 10, 15, 20 seconds to fire as many small rounds as they can at you, which might be somewhat distracting as you're sitting up there painting the target. I'm just saying, I put them on helicopters as well. Not a big fan of tow missiles. I like fire and forget better. Anyway, that was just my thing on tow missiles and the Maginot Line. But no, I'm not sensing you being safe from modern munitions. You're barely safe from World War II munitions. And then I had a question if the Germans had a round bouncing bomb. I'm sure this might have been inspired by the Kugelpanzer that I cannot wait to go see in the Russian museum. The Allies had the upkeep bomb that they would bounce, and it would bounce on the water. And the Germans captured one after Operation Upkeep in the wreckage of a Lancaster bomber that had not detonated. It got caught up in some wires, and the Germans pulled it out and decided, well, they were going to test one of these things. And they made a 385 kilogram bomb called Kurt and Emil, and the Luftwaffe tested it off the Thalmunde testing sites and 4 other facilities. The problem with the upkeep bomb is what keeps it going the way it's supposed to is the backspin. And the Germans didn't seem to have picked up on the backspin part, so when they dropped it, it was more of a risk to the pilot that dropped it. It would be dropped at the same speed of the aircraft, and it would bounce right off the water and almost hit the aircraft. So in 1944, they canceled the program, which would also lead me to think, well, where would the Germans deploy this against? There was not a whole lot of dams or things. It was supposed to be as opposed to torpedoes that would get caught up or entangled in torpedo netting. We're still looking at a large explosive that the side of a large battleship may not do. It probably wouldn't sink it, especially enough if it's a well-armored battleship and it would explode off the side. It wouldn't have a penetrating warhead or point like a shell to actually penetrate the armor. So I'm not entirely sure what good the Germans would have done with a bouncing bomb. But they had one, they played with it, and then they gave up using it. So yes, there was one, Kurt and Emil. And there's only like one picture I could find. When I get to the testing sites, maybe there will be a museum that maybe have one. But there's a lot of experimental munitions that no one really kept pictures or track of. They were destroyed or discarded some way. And then for something fun, Brad, he's asking me a similar question to what I was asked some time ago. If I was being dropped in a desolate area with extremely basic survival kit, what would and I only had 20 rounds of ammunition, what World War I to present day rifle would I insist on having? You're not setting the stage for me here. I need a little bit more of the script, Brad. But all right, if you're dropping me in a desolate place and you're giving me 20 rounds only, I am assuming, because I may as well, assuming a few things. I'll be in a somewhat hostile environment. I'll be there for a while, which means at some point in time I'm going to need to eat, which means hunting might be a thing. And since I'm alone and I only have 20 rounds, keeping bad guys at bay at a distance would also be a thing. And since I might be there for a while, again, I don't want anything delicate or clever that may break down on me and I can't fix it in the field or with what I have. Yes, I know you're thinking AK, but no. Because I only have 20 rounds, so I have to make damn sure that every one of them hits. And with that, I'm going to have to go with my favorite, one of my favorite World War II weapons. I'm going to have to go with the K9 Mauser with a scope, the one I carried in this little movie, because I can keep people at a good distance. If bad people are coming, I can't fight them off, but I can reach out and touch them at a good 600-700 meters away fairly comfortably with a Mauser. It's a good bullet. It's also a good bullet for hunting in case I would need to. So I think that would be my safest bet. Certainly nothing automatic. Probably not even any, or semi-automatic. Maybe a G3. I'm sorry, G3. Maybe a G43. A G43 would be an option. It's accurate, but I'm not expecting, given what you told me or what you didn't tell me, that I'll be fighting my way out. I'm just going to try to survive and keep, the occasional zombies at bay. So that's kind of good old-fashioned Mauser K98 with the scope that's sighted, because if it's not, I'll really be screwed. And one of you guys asked me what happened to the big rail guns like Doa, and I answered that in the chat, but I found I want to answer them. The Germans destroyed them before the Allies could get them, and then the Russians carted off the rest, and one disappeared in Russia, and one was destroyed and melted down. But I found one photo that I just wanted to show you of what it looked like halfway disassembled by the Germans, and that was sort of that was the last known photo that I could find of one of the big railway guns. Okay, what's coming? I'm going to try to get to some of the other questions, some of the unanswered questions I have for the next Q&A. I got to go back and start editing on the episode to Fort Ibn Amal, because there's actually a couple of things on the attack on Fortress Ibn Amal that I haven't seen in mainstream history about the assault on the fort, and some things that went wrong, and some things that, well, involve a priest and some pretty girls that went wrong, and there's a few things to it that I think was really interesting, given my visit. It's always nice when you're actually there and you get a little bit more information than. And one thing I will say about Fort Ibn Amal, it is huge. Yeah, it is. Upcoming Q&As are, yes, the U-boat carrying mercury. I'm going to talk more about that. I think the Swedish divers found it, but there's more to it, and there's a lot of mercury that seemed to be floating around on that. The Kristianstad ammunition factory, when I get there, yes, I will actually go have a look at that. And as Q&A on the German C3 computer, the first actual computer in the world, and multi-purpose weapons of World War II. We can always say the 88, but yes, I'm going to break that down. I want to do a little bit more research on that, because offhand I'm not finding as many as I would expect. So give me a little minute on that. You're not forgotten. Yes, I want to do a special on Rudolf Hess and Spandauer, and I want to do a prison. Prison, not the Danish bread roll Spandauer. Just, and I want to do a special on the KG 200, Kampfgeschwader 200, which I visited their hangar when I was out by Jubburg. And those 3 episodes from there is going to be really, really cool. We're going to walk through some really interesting places that most of you have not seen. And no, we are not going to the Neue Lager, Adolf Hitler Lager. We're going to Altes Lager and a couple of other places that you have not seen. I promise you haven't seen those. I'm going to have a couple of Q&A on tank comparisons, including the Stug and, of course, the Swedish Stug, although you say it's not a tank destroyer, but come on, we'll talk about that. I'm also working on a special on the Ahnenerbe. And finally, before I get back to working on some episodes, yes, I will probably surrender and do a Patreon account somehow, and or set up a PayPal, because well, YouTube revenue is not as much as one would hope for, and pretty much gave up on my day job so I could sit home and edit videos. But as we go to Poland, and I'm gonna have to hire some LiDAR and do some scans, and I'm gonna have to talk to some people, and some of them I'm going to have to pay for their technical services. And well, you know, if we all kind of want to know, so if anybody want to kick in $5, we'll probably get to that. Just have to figure out how Patreon works, or we're just gonna set up and do it together, at least for the trip. And what else? I'm sure there's something else I wanted to tell you, besides how much I absolutely love all you guys for writing all the cool comments. And Steve, just remember, you're not watching anymore because you fell asleep, but I'm watching wearing this shirt for you, just because you love it so much, so bite me. It's an eternal thing, don't ask. I have a meeting with Victor Schauberger's grandson, who will talk about the Schauberger. And I have a meeting set up with the Polish researcher, Jurek out there about his research into the Riese. And of course, I'm looking very much forward to meeting with George Rabienski out at the S3. And so, I mean, I have some really good meetings set up. I'm still waiting for Bergkristal to see if they will let us into the tunnels. And I'm hoping they will. It's, you know, everything in Germany, if it's not illegal, it can't be done. This one I'm kind of hoping will be able to be done, because they're only open a couple of days, and I am determined to visit every one of Himmlers' production facilities. And I'm also going to spend a little time in Norway to see some of the forts up there. I'm going to visit some of the Maginot Line forts and some of the World War I forts as well. Ludovic out at Fort Cassel have agreed to be dragged around some of the surrounding forts. Some restored, some not, which will be really, really cool, because he can tell us everything and I won't have to read books about it, which is amazing. Showing up with an empty mind, yes. There's a joke in there and I don't. Anyway, I want to go back to editing because I got some episodes. I want to make sure that just because I'm traveling, I'm still leaving you guys with something to watch. And I will see you all soon.